and no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. For sounds are dependent upon perceivers. John Locke, who believes in primary qualities, would not deny the existence of what? Vibrations. But vibrations are not sounds. I've had students in the past say, but what if somebody set up tape recorders? Yeah, that's old school. What if somebody set up tape recorders out in the forest to record the sound of falling trees? Wouldn't it make a sound then? I go, when you play it back. Because remember, the vibrations are not the same things as sounds. Sounds are a function of vibrations. The vibrations are the primary quality according to Locke. The sound is a secondary quality. Secondary qualities require perceivers. This is why George Berkeley, the second in the line of empiricists, remember that line he has, to be is to be perceived? He denies the existence of primary qualities. Because the fact is, all we really experience are ideas that exist where? All of our ideas exist in the mind. We cannot actually know that an external, material reality exists. Because every single experience that we have is a mental event. Now, as a religious man, remember he was Bishop Berkeley, he was an Anglican bishop. The dominant viewpoint at that time was that God was pure spirit. Because material things are what? By their nature, faulty, imperfect, etc., etc. So the question would be, why would a perfect God create a material world? Bishop Berkeley said that God did not create a material world, and that everything that exists in the world is actually what? Ideas. Now, of course, many people would like to make what's called a refutation by demonstration. For Berkeley, pain doesn't exist in your body, it exists in your mind. So pain is not materially real. The critic might say, I'll show you one, Berkeley, and chock him with a chair or something like that. Tell me that's just an idea in your mind. Well, guess what Berkeley would say? Yeah, he'd say, the pain exists in my mind. You cannot prove that an external material world exists. Because everything that you know is an idea that exists in the mind. And you have no actual proof that the cause of those things is an external material world. He's not denying that there's a world. He's denying that you could know that it is made of this mysterious substance called matter. Because all you actually know are the affects. Does that make sense? All you actually know are the affects. Every idea in your mind is an idea. You never experience this thing called matter. What I experience is solidity. What I experience is the color of this board. What I experience is the coolness of the water in the bottle. I don't experience matter. I experience ideas, according to Berkeley. Now, there's a reason why this argument doesn't seem plausible, no matter how logical it is. And it's probably because most of us make knee-jerk Lockean assumptions. Because we've been told from a very young age, what? That the world is made up of this stuff called matter. And even if we can't prove that, it's very difficult to shake those assumptions. And by the way, even if we believe, as Berkeley did, would it change anything? I mean, no, it wouldn't change anything. Because the fact is, I still experience the color blue. I still smell rotten eggs, whatever. But it just doesn't add on that thing, and they're made of matter. that ends up being superfluous. Now, that was a quick rundown of Berkeleyan immaterialism. The granddaddy of all the empiricists, well, I guess he's not the granddaddy because he's the third in the line of the so-called great British empiricists. He was technically Scottish, but that was all part of the Anglo-philosophical world, is David Hume. The importance of David Hume cannot be overstated. The fact is, he was not a renowned philosopher during his lifetime. And the author of the text does talk a little bit about his bio. He was actually more renowned as an historian during his lifetime than as a philosopher. Much of his philosophical work was actually published posthumously after he was dead. However, he did have a major influence. This one's pretty much kaput. He was a major influence on his younger contemporary, Adam Smith. David Hume also wrote on economics, and a lot of those ideas on economics and trade show up in Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. And I might also add that Adam Smith's Theory of the Moral Sentiment, which was a book that he became famous for, all of those ideas were already contained in the writings of David Hume. All of those ideas were already contained in David Hume. Another reason why you can't oversell his importance is because the philosopher Immanuel Kant will have read the skeptical analysis of Hume, and he will articulate that the problems that arise out of Hume, that is, he undermines a lot of our philosophical assumptions. He says, Hume's skepticism had awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. In other words, if I am going to save certain elements of philosophy, and indeed our assumptions about science, I am going to have answers to Hume's brand of skepticism, which Immanuel Kant believed that he did. We'll talk about him in another lecture. But yeah. Yeah, and that's sort of the point. That the important German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, did have to find answers to Hume's skepticism in order to save elements of philosophy from radical skepticism. Now, what is Hume's radical skepticism and what led him there? Well, the culmination of his skepticism will be what the author of our text refers to as the empirical criterion of meaning. The empirical criterion of meaning, once we've talked about it, should not shock you very much. Because Hume would argue that he was merely taking the starting points of empiricism and taking them to their logical final destination. And if you don't like the results of it, that's just the way it goes. Because if you take empiricism seriously, there is technically nothing that you can know for certain. Nothing you can know with a capital K, to use that cliche. Now, the starting point of empiricism was what? That all knowledge begins with sensory experience. The empirical criterion of meaning changes that up a little bit. It contends that all meaningful claims, or utterances is the phrase he uses, that all meaningful claims must be traceable back to sensory experience. Now, when he talks about a claim being a meaningful claim, he is talking about a meaningful ability to either say that we can verify it or falsify it. In other words, a means of finding some kind of evidence for either saying, I believe it's probably true, or I think we ought to call the claim false. Now, the reason that I would say there is a bottle over there on the desk is because I see it with my senses. That would be my fiat, my reason, for saying there's a bottle over there. Is it plausible that there might not be a bottle over there? Well, yeah, somebody could have dosed me and I might be dreaming or whatever. Pick your form of skepticism, and it's possible that my claim might be wrong. But the thing is, when I make a claim like there is a bottle over there, I'm at least making a claim that can be verified via my senses, insofar as I can trust my senses. Or if I make the claim, Harrisburg Area Community College is Pennsylvania's community college, we would say, yeah, that's a true claim, because that's our motto. Now, whether or not that's a reasonable piece of evidence or not is up for debate. But at least that's a claim that we can understand what it means, and then we could figure out what kind of evidence would show it to be true or perhaps bogus. Or, I've got 10 flannel shirts in my closet at home. I see some flannel out there, so I thought I'd throw that in there. Now, how would I go about demonstrating whether that claim is true or false? Go home, rummage through my closet. If I can't find 10 flannel shirts, then the claim's false. This is an empirical claim. David Hume called such claims matter-of-fact claims. When it comes to matters of fact, we are making claims that can be either shown to be probably true or probably false, based upon what our senses give us. But you'll note that we can never have 100% certainty about matter-of-fact claims. And this is because what do we know about our senses?
They can deceive us.
Yeah, they can deceive us. They do not give us perfect accounts of quote-unquote reality, whatever that means. Now, the other kind of claims, and the text doesn't go into this detail, the other kinds of claims that we can make according to Hume are called relations of ideas. I repeat, relations of ideas. I'll give you an easy example of a relation of ideas. A triangle is a three-sided regular polygon. A triangle is a three-sided regular polygon. Now, what determines if that statement is true or not? Yeah, if it lines up with the logical definition of a triangle. 2 plus 3 equals 5 is also a relation of ideas. According to Hume, we can have certainty about those kind of judgments because they are through reason alone. But the reason why he didn't hold them up on a pedestal like Descartes did is because a priori, or what he calls relations of ideas, tell us nothing about what? They tell us nothing about sensory reality. They merely relate concepts to one another. Now, if I make a claim, there is a triangle in my Winnie the Pooh board book. Now, that is not an a priori or relation of ideas. That is what Hume would call a matter of fact. Why? Because it's actually referring to something that we could verify. We'd get out my Winnie the Pooh board book and we'd see if there's a triangle in there and say, yeah, Piglet's holding one. Oh, this is true. Like, didn't everybody have Winnie the Pooh board books when they were youngsters? Well, I didn't, but my kids did. But anyway, we didn't have board books back in the Stone Age, or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, there are these two kinds of truth claims that we can make. Call them judgments. Relations of ideas, which are trivially true because they tell us nothing about external reality, as we call it. And there are matters of fact claims. These are never known for certainty, but only probability based upon how much we can trust the data before us. Now, the conclusion that he's drawing here is that we can never really know anything regarding our senses for certain. Now, there's another very serious consequence. These truth claims that are this, the empirical criterion of meaning will basically suggest that all of our metaphysical claims that we make are what Hume would call meaningless utterances. Now, by meaningless, he's not necessarily saying that we don't care about them. What he's saying is they can neither be verified nor falsified. And it's also the fact that because there's no actual data about them to be recovered, we can't even have meaningful concepts of them. Now, as a result, all of the, like I said, all of the things that we would call metaphysical truth claims are under assault according to Hume's analysis. And this is why Kant needed to have an answer. Now let me talk about a handful of things that fall under siege due to the empirical criterion. Darn it. I'm going to go through a short list of some of the ideas that many people hold near and dear that will fall under siege due to Hume's empirical criterion of meaning. I'm just abbreviating that just to save pen and for brevity because we all know what I'm talking about if we read the textbook. One of the first things that falls under siege that we're going to discuss is the very idea of God. Now, Hume says, let's take a look at the so-called idea of God. And he's talking about the one that we talked about earlier. Remember that Cartesian definition of God as infinite perfection? Hume will contend that we can have no meaningful concept of God because we have no meaningful idea of perfection. We can have no meaningful idea of God because we have no meaningful idea of perfection. That is, the idea is nonsense. And by the way, that word nonsense, you notice, has a dual meaning. It literally means not sensed. But notice, we call things nonsense for the very same reason. Meaning that, well, it doesn't make any sense. And that's what Hume's saying. We can have no meaningful concept of God because it's not an empirical concept. Now, because of this, he says, the existence of God can neither be what? Yeah, it can neither be verified nor falsified. But that ought to be cold comfort to the believer for two reasons. Number one, because he's just said you can't really have a meaningful idea of God. And simply because you can't prove it or disprove it doesn't mean that you have rational reason to believe in God. As a matter of fact, he suggests that the idea doesn't really compute. And this is why on the question of God, a consistent skeptic would cry what? The consistent skeptic would cry agnosticism. But again, this ought to be cold comfort to the believer. Because he says there's no reason to believe, and there's no reason not to believe. So in effect, that more or less makes Hume a what anyway? This is why many students, when they read Hume, will say he was an atheist. Well, technically, he says the only consistent position is agnosticism. However, to be a consistent agnostic is more or less to be a consistent atheist anyway, because it's not to be a believer. Because he says the belief in it has no reason, no verification. Now later on, others picking up on Hume will understand that people have psychological reasons for believing. In other words, not rational reasons, but psychological reasons for believing. For example, Sigmund Freud, who's not covered in our text, understood that human beings have this strange relationship with death. As a matter of fact, most people spend their entire lives denying that they are ever personally going to die, because the idea is too what for many people? It's too unfathomable. It's too scary. The thought of my own non-existence, I can't even think about it. So we don't think about it, even though it's inevitable. However, many people's religions give them a what? Out. Yeah, it gives them an out. My cosmic father figure will give me eternal life. I'm speaking like Freud here. He says that's just simple wish fulfillment here. You have no logical reason to believe in eternal life. It's just a psychological defense mechanism. More on that perhaps later. So yeah, he dismisses the idea of God as a meaningless utterance. Next thing on our list. I'm going to handle these two together, folks. He discusses the topic of both so-called religious histories as well as the concept of miracles. Now, ladies and gentlemen, he notes that many people's religious histories, in their sacred books, tell a lot of stories that a lot of people believe on some kind of faith. However, if a person who you didn't know told you such tall tales, such as the parting of the Red Sea, or the turning of the water into wine. I know I'm starting to sound sacrilegious here, but I'm playing David Hume. If you heard another person's religious story from an outside religion, would you find those claims to be plausible at all? No, you would say it was made up by some Buddhists, or made up by some Hindus, or whatever. In other words, you would trash it and call it stupid. But nonetheless, when the same kind of things that you wouldn't believe in other people's religions show up in your own, it's perfectly reasonable to believe. He says if most people weren't letting their emotions get involved or get in the way of their judgment, they would see that a lot of the stories in a person's religion's history are certainly things that ought not to be believed. They ought to be doubted. Now, I'll give you the more technical side of the argument here. There are many things that we believe on the basis of what we call authority. We kind of talked about this topic before. What do I mean by knowledge that is known on the basis of authority? Any takers, Marazzo?
Something that's just kind of been instilled in you.
Yeah, or something that's been taken on somebody else's good word, you know, that kind of thing. I'll give you go ahead.
Isn't that kind of almost everything that you learn, though?
Well, I'd say at least a lot of it. Suppose somebody said, hey JG, guess what? I saw out in the parking lot that your left rear tire is flat. Now you notice that I might, if I think you're a trustworthy source, I would likely do what? Yeah, well, I would probably believe you, and then I would go check it out. Now that's a case of something that I could go check out now. But what about something from 2,500 years ago that allegedly happened? It's not like we can go and verify it with our senses. So we've got to take it on the basis of an authority.